Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The desert heat of the Arizona territory pressed down without mercy. The ground shimmered, cracked, and brittle. Eli McCall, a man in his mid-30s with a frame hardened by years of cattle trails and the silence of lonely nights, guided his bay gelding along a dry wash. His purpose was simple but heavy. He was moving east, looking for day work on ranches near Dry Lantern. He had drifted for too long, his past scarred with loss. A brother dead from fever, a friend shot in a saloon fight, and a woman who once told him he had no place to settle because men like him belonged only to the road. Those words still echoed when he tried to sleep. Nate walked a short distance ahead, barefooted in soft moccasins, light steps that read the land as if the stones and dust spoke to her. She carried a pouch of herbs, a knife, and a coil of rawhide rope. Exiled by her own people for refusing an arranged marriage and treated with suspicion by settlers, she had survived by trading what knowledge she carried: medicine, beadwork, and water signs. Now, her plan was to reach Dry Lantern, exchange what she could, and keep moving before anyone had the chance to pin her down. Their paths had crossed a week earlier when Eli found her camp by accident. He had offered food in exchange for her guiding him through a stretch of desert where his maps were little more than guesswork. It was not friendship, not yet, but necessity had bound them together. He needed her knowledge of the land, and she needed his horse and his gun in places where strangers were unwelcome. The silence broke with a sharp, dry rattle. Eli's boot had landed too close to a coiled rattlesnake hidden beneath a sage clump. The strike came quick, striking high on the inside of his thigh. He staggered back, his hat tipping off his head, his hand clamping down instinctively as if pressure alone could stop the venom. Damn it, his voice came ragged, more from shock than anger. Nate froze for half a breath, her eyes fixed on the fangs retracting, the dust shifting as the snake pulled back. Then she moved, quick, calm, deliberate. She pushed him down against his saddle roll before his knees gave way. Eli's chest heaved. Pain surged up his leg, burning sharp and deep. His mind scrambled between anger, shame, and the sudden cold awareness that a bite this high could kill him fast. He thought of his brother, how helpless he had looked when fever had taken him. Eli cursed under his breath. Not like this, not helpless in front of a stranger. Nature's thoughts cut through fast. She had seen bites before, on hunters and children back in her camp. The venom spread quickly if left unchecked. She knew the choice, and she knew what it demanded. She tore a strip of cloth from her skirt, tied it above the wound, and looked at him once, her face steady, asking for no permission. He shook his head weakly, voice strained. Don't do that. I'll manage." "You won't," she said flatly. "Stay still." Before he could protest further, she pressed her mouth against the puncture, pulled, and spat dark red into the dust. She repeated the motion, fast, controlled. Eli's jaw tightened with embarrassment and helpless fury. His chest rose and fell unevenly, but as the dizziness started to creep up, the fight drained out of him. He stopped resisting. His hand trembled on the blanket, his breath catching. Inside, a shame deeper than pain hollowed him out. This woman, treated as an outcast herself, was the only reason he still had a chance. He hated the weakness that forced him to depend on her, yet part of him felt a raw, almost desperate gratitude. Nate did not let herself think beyond the moment. Fear pressed at the edge of her mind. Fear of failing, fear of the venom already moving too far, but she kept her motion steady. Draw, spit, repeat. Each time she spat, she checked his color, listened to his breathing, and noted the slowing pulse at his neck. Minutes stretched like hours until she finally stopped, wiping her mouth on her wrist, her breathing sharp. She bound the wound with clean cloth and tightened it with a stick. Her hands worked with certainty, but her heart beat fast enough to make her chest ache. Eli slumped back against the saddle roll, sweat streaking his face, eyes half-lidded. He managed to mutter, low and rough, You kept me alive." Nate looked at him without expression, though inside her chest was tight. "No, you kept yourself alive by not fighting me." For a long moment, neither spoke. The desert was silent but for the faint hum of heat. The rattlesnake was gone. All that remained was the sound of Eli's strained breathing and the heavy truth that in the space of a few minutes, the distance between two exiles, one from her people, the other from his own past, had shifted in a way neither could ignore. The sun was still high when Eli's breathing steadied, but the worst of the pain had left him pale and weak. His thigh burned, wrapped in the cloth Nate had tied tight. He leaned against the saddle roll, his hat shading his eyes. Sweat ran down his temples, and each swallow of dry air felt heavy, yet he held on. Nate sat close, her face calm but alert, eyes moving between his leg, his color, and the horizon. She had learned to measure silence the way others measure time. It told her how much strength a person had left. Eli's silence now was not the steady kind, but the brittle one, and she knew he was weighing whether he would see another sunrise. She poured a little water into a tin cup, mixed in a few drops of whiskey, and handed it to him. He hesitated, his pride catching on the simple act of being helped, but the heat and thirst won out. He drank slowly, grimacing. His voice came rough. "How bad?" Nate looked at the wound again before answering. "You will live if the swelling doesn't climb. I have drawn out most, but you need rest." His hand tightened around the tin cup. He hated the thought of stopping. Every day on the trail mattered. The cattle work he sought in Dry Lantern would not wait forever. Money was short, and so was patience. He shifted, as if testing whether he could stand, but the sharp pull in his leg forced him back with a hiss of breath. He hated the weakness more than the pain. Nate saw his frustration and spoke before it hardened into anger. "One day lost is better than all days lost. You cannot ride if your leg fails." Her words were plain, not cruel, but they cut through his pride. He realized she was right, though it gnawed at him. He pressed the cup into the dust, leaned his head back, and closed his eyes. His mind drifted to the reason he was out here at all. Dry Lantern had ranches hiring for the fall drive, and he needed the work, not just for coin, but for the chance to prove he wasn't finished yet. He had spent years drifting from one camp to another, never staying long, always leaving before ties could take root. This time he had promised himself he would at least try to stay if the place let him. That promise felt thin now, bleeding into the dirt along with the venom. Nate tended to the fire, small and controlled, using mesquite twigs. As the beans softened in the pot, she thought of the man lying a few feet away. She had agreed to guide him through the desert because he offered food and coin, and she had expected nothing more. Now his life had depended on her hands and her decision. She remembered the look in his eyes when he resisted her help. Shame, fear, stubbornness. She had seen that look before in men who hated to be weak in front of anyone, especially a woman. Yet, unlike others, he had stopped fighting her, and that mattered. She broke the silence. "Why are you alone?" His eyes opened, heavy-lidded, the firelight catching the lines carved deep in his face. He did not answer at once. He thought of lies, of simple half-truths, but the venom had stripped him of the strength to pretend. "Because the people I trusted are gone. One died of fever, another by a bullet. The woman I asked to marry told me I belonged to the trail, not to her. Maybe she was right." Nate nodded once, her expression unreadable. "The trail is not a person. It does not care if you live or die. People care, even if they wound you." Her words settled between them, neither soft nor sharp. She stirred the pot, then handed him a portion when it was ready. He ate slowly, each bite grounding him. The food was simple, but it reminded him that he was still here, still breathing. Later, as night came down and the fire shrank to embers, Nate tied the horses close, checked Eli's leg one last time, and sat across from him. The desert was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears. Eli fought the urge to speak just to fill it, but the weight of her presence stopped him. He realized she was not uncomfortable with silence. She had lived too long in spaces where words were weapons. He began to understand that silence itself could be a kind of trust. Lying back against the saddle roll, he stared at the stars. The thought circled in his mind. He owed her his life. He didn't know how to say it without sounding weak, so he left it unsaid. though his eyes lingered on her before sleep pulled him under. Nate sat awake a while longer, her thoughts turning not to pride, but to caution. Saving his life had tied her to him in a way she had not chosen. She wondered if this would anchor her to another place she would have to leave, or if, for once, it might lead somewhere different. By dawn, the desert had cooled enough for Eli to open his eyes and feel the shift in the air. The wound on his thigh throbbed, but it was not the consuming fire it had been yesterday. He moved his hand carefully, feeling the cloth bandage still tight around his leg. Relief mixed with unease. He was alive, but he was still far from strong. Nate was already awake, crouched near the fire's gray coals, grinding dried leaves between her palms. She added them to a small pot of water, letting the steam carry a bitter, earthy smell. "You will drink this," she said without looking up. Eli grunted, trying to push himself higher against the saddle roll. "What is it?" "Plants that fight sickness. Your body is weak, and the venom can still spread if it wants." Her voice was calm, steady, but the firmness left no room for argument. He took the tin cup when she handed it over. The taste was harsh, dry against his tongue, but he forced it down. His mind turned restless with questions about her, about why she was really helping him. Yesterday, she said little, and he realized he knew almost nothing about the woman who had put her mouth on a deadly wound to keep him alive. He had told her pieces of his own story, but hers remained hidden. When he asked quietly, "Why did you leave your people?" she did not answer at once. She sat back on her heels, her eyes fixed on the fading stars. Finally, she said, "My uncle wanted me to marry a man I did not choose. When I refused, they called me ungrateful. Some said cursed. I walked away before they could decide what else to do with me." Eli listened in silence, understanding the weight in her voice. She did not speak with drama or plea, just with the plainness of someone who had no illusions left. He thought of his own failures, how he had let others decide he was made for drifting, how he had never argued back. He wondered if leaving everything behind was strength or just another kind of exile. The question nagged him, so he asked, "Do you ever think about going back?" Nate shook her head. "A woman who leaves has no place to return. To them, I am gone already." That truth sat between them, heavier than the rattlesnake strike. Eli felt a tug of empathy, not spoken, but sitting in his chest. For the first time, he realized they were alike. Two people cut off from what they once belonged to, surviving only by moving forward. As the sun climbed, Nate checked his leg again. She loosened the cloth carefully, cleaned the wound with water, and retied it. Her hands were steady, but Eli saw the faint tension in her jaw. She carried responsibility for his life now, and that weight was not small. He tried to ease it. "You don't have to do this, you know. I'll heal, or I won't. Either way, it's not your burden." Her eyes flashed, sharp for the first time. "You think I would leave a man to die when I can stop it? That would make me the same as those who cast me out. I won't be that." Eli looked at her, surprised by the strength behind her words. He gave a small nod and let it go. Inwardly, though, the thought unsettled him. He wasn't used to anyone claiming responsibility for him. It stirred something he didn't know how to name. By midday, they broke camp slowly. Nate led the horses, careful to keep Eli from straining his leg. The trail ahead stretched flat and endless, the heat shimmering above the sand. Eli moved with effort, leaning on the gelding's saddle horn when he mounted. Every motion sent sharp reminders through his thigh, but he forced himself to sit tall. He hated the look of weakness, especially in front of her. Nate noticed, though she said nothing. What she did instead was adjust their pace, taking longer pauses under scattered mesquite and offering him water more often than she admitted was necessary. Her silence was not cold. It was practical, steadying. Eli began to see that this was her way of showing care, through action, not through comfort. That night, after they set camp again, Eli found himself watching her as she worked with quiet efficiency, laying out herbs to dry, checking the horses, making sure the fire was low and safe. He thought about the kind of life she had led to learn all this alone. The question rose before he could stop it. "What do you want, Nate? What are you chasing out here?" She looked across the fire at him, her face lit by its glow. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she answered, voice plain as always. I'm not chasing. I'm staying alive. One place to another, trade enough to eat. Move on before men with eyes like cutters decide. I am theirs to claim. That is all. Eli's chest tightened at her words. He thought of the men she meant, those who would treat her as property because she had no one to stand beside her. He had seen that kind before and had never done much to stop them. The guilt pricked at him now. The desert wind swept through camp, stirring the embers. Eli shifted against his blanket, the pain in his thigh reminding him of his own fragility. He realized how easily he could have died, how easily she could have left him there. Instead, she stayed, risking herself by tying her fate to his. He didn't say thank you again. It felt too small, but he met her gaze and held it longer than before. When she looked away, he closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt the faint pull of something like belonging. It was not to a town or a ranch, but to the silence they shared, to the fact that they were both still here, side by side, when neither of them should have been. By the third morning, Eli's legs showed signs of holding steady. The swelling had not spread, the fever had not come, and his strength was returning in small but steady measures. He could swing into the saddle now, though he did it with a wince and a sharp intake of breath. Nate watched closely, not hiding her caution. She had seen men push too hard after an injury, only to collapse later. Eli noticed her eyes on him, and though he wanted to shrug it off, he stayed quiet and let her set the pace. The road ahead stretched flat, with the faint line of cottonwoods marking where a stream should be. Their supplies were thinning, water near empty, flour low, beans almost gone. Eli knew the question must be pressing on anyone watching. Why hadn't they prepared better before riding into such country? The truth was simple but hard to admit. Eli had left his last job in a hurry, after a dispute with a foreman who thought every man in camp should drink with him or be branded disloyal. Eli didn't drink much anymore. He had packed what he could carry, but it wasn't enough for a long crossing. Nate had her pouch of herbs and dried meat, but she lived light, always ready to move before people grew suspicious or hostile. Between them, they had enough to reach Dry Lantern, but only if nothing went wrong. The snake bite had nearly broken that fragile balance. When they reached the stream, Eli slid off his horse carefully. Nate crouched by the bank, showing him how to dig a shallow basin lined with stones so the water would clear of silt. She worked with patience, her hands sure in the dirt, as if she had done it 100 times. Eli watched her for a moment before kneeling beside her to help. He wanted to prove he was not just dead weight. The act steadied him, though his leg ached. As they filled their canteens, Eli asked the question he had been circling around since the bite. Why are you heading east, Nate? Not just surviving, there must be something pulling you that way. She didn't answer right away. She took a drink first, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and then said, there is a trading post at Dry Lantern. I can exchange herbs and beadwork for salt, flour, coffee. Enough to keep moving. That is all. Her answer was practical, but Eli sensed more beneath it. He let it rest. He had learned that pressing her too hard only closed her off. Instead, he spoke of himself. I'm to find work there. Cattle drive's coming. I've drifted too long. Need coin, need something steady. Tired of leaving before I even arrive. Nate studied him a long moment. And if they do not take you, if they look at your face and see only another drifter? Eli didn't flinch at the bluntness. He had asked himself the same. Then I'll keep moving. But I've had enough of moving. This time I'll push harder. Maybe that's the difference. As they traveled on, Eli noticed the land shifting, scattered cabins, split rail fences, and the faint outline of smoke in the distance. Dry Lantern wasn't far now, but questions hung in the air, the kind any listener might ask. Would Nate even be allowed inside a settlement without trouble? Would Eli's reputation as a loner keep him out of steady work? And more pressing, what if the men there saw Nate as something to claim, not respect? That evening, camped beneath cottonwoods, Eli found himself restless. He could see the flicker of her fire-lit face as she tended the pot, and the unease in his chest grew sharper. He finally spoke. When we reach Dry Lantern, you won't be welcome. Not at first. Towns like that. Men look at you and think they know what you're worth. You need to be ready for that. Nate stirred the pot slowly. I know. I have walked into many towns. I know how men look. Her voice did not tremble, but Eli heard the steel in it. You'll need someone to stand beside you, he said, the words out before he fully chose them. Not because you can't fight them, because they won't give you a chance to prove you can. She looked at him then, long and steady, her dark eyes reflecting the fire. And you'll be that someone? Eli shifted, his leg aching but his voice steady. I owe you my life. That's reason enough. Nate didn't answer. She only handed him his share of food and sat back, her face unreadable. But in her silence, Eli thought he saw something shift. Not gratitude, not trust, not yet, but the beginning of a space where those things could take root. They ate in quiet, the air heavy with the questions of tomorrow. Dry Lantern was close. What awaited them there? Work, conflict, belonging, or rejection would soon be answered. For now, they shared food and fire, bound by survival, heading toward a place that could decide the shape of both their futures. By the following afternoon, Eli and Nate reached Dry Lantern. The settlement sat low against the horizon, a handful of plank buildings, a water tower with peeling paint, and the slow churn of a windmill creaking against the wind. A corral stood half-mended near the edge of town, cattle nosing through sparse hay. Dust hung in the air, stirred by wagons and the shuffle of boots. It wasn't a place of welcome, but a place people endured because it was the only one for miles. Eli felt the weight of his leg as he dismounted, though he tried not to show it. He knew the question would rise in anyone's mind watching this. Was he strong enough to seek ranch work so soon after the bite? He wasn't. Not fully, but ranch jobs never waited for men to be ready. He would force his body to hold steady until it did. He tied his gelding at the hitching rail outside the general store and helped Nate down, careful to mask the wince in his own movements. Inside, the store smelled of dry grain, leather oil, and old wood. A few townsfolk stood scattered, 2 women with flour sacks, a ranch hand weighing nails, a clerk behind the counter sorting ledgers. The moment Eli and Nate stepped through the door, conversation thinned. People noticed her first. Her dress was worn but clean, her hair tied back with rawhide, her moccasins soft against the boards. She didn't lower her gaze, but the silence that followed was sharp. The clerk, a square-shouldered man with a trimmed beard, finally spoke. What's she here for? Trading or trouble? The words carried a smirk, framed as a joke, but the edge beneath was clear. Eli's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, placed a handful of coins on the counter, and pressed his palm over them. His voice was even calm. We need flour, coffee, salt. Nothing more. Nothing less. The clerk looked at him, then at Nate, then back at the coins. His eyes weighed whether to push the insult further. Eli kept his hand firm on the counter, meeting his stare until the man finally gave a single, sharp nod and reached for the goods. The tension bled slowly from the room, though not fully. Nate stood silent through the exchange, but inside her chest, she felt the old knot of weariness tighten. This was not the first town to greet her like this. She wondered if it would ever be different. She reminded herself of the promise she carried, to stay alive, to keep moving, to never let their eyes define her worth. But still stung. As Eli gathered the supplies, a ranch hand by the stove muttered just loud enough. Snake and outcast belong in the same dirt. His name was Cutter, though neither Eli nor Nate knew it yet. The words hit Eli harder than he expected. He knew what it meant to be called a drifter, a useless hand, a man who couldn't stay. But seeing Nate carry that same weight in a place she hadn't even set foot in before, it angered him in a way he hadn't felt for himself. He turned slightly, steady voice cutting through. You got something to say? Say it plain. Cutter smirked, leaning back in his chair. Just making talk. Don't see why we're sharing goods with. He stopped when Nate moved. She stepped forward, slow but deliberate, her pouch of herbs in hand. Her voice was calm, carrying clearly. This is willow bark. For fever. This is yarrow. Stops bleeding. This is sage. clears sickness from the air. Tell me, which of your families has no sickness? No wounds? No cough in the night? The room shifted. Eyes that had been filled with suspicion now followed her words, drawn by their plain usefulness. Even Cutter's smirk faltered. He had no answer, and the silence stretched long enough to mark his defeat. He muttered something low and turned his gaze to the floor. Eli said nothing, but pride flickered in his chest. She hadn't needed his defense. She had held her ground with skill sharper than fists. Still, he stayed close as they carried their goods outside. On the boardwalk, Nage's hands were steady, but Eli could see the slight tension in her shoulders. He wanted to say something, thank you, maybe, or that she didn't deserve their stares, but the words stuck. Instead, he adjusted the sack of flour on his shoulder and said, "We'll set camp near the cottonwoods." Out of sight of town, she gave a single nod. That was enough. The unspoken questions followed them as they walked. Would the ranchers here hire Eli despite his limp? Would Nate be left in peace long enough to trade her herbs and move on? Could they remain side by side in a town that saw her as trouble and him as a drifting loner? None of the answers had come yet. But tonight, they would have fire, food, and a space of quiet to prepare for whatever Dry Lantern decided they were worth. They camped just beyond the cottonwoods at the edge of town, where the stream bent wide enough to water horses and still offer some cover. Eli stacked their new supplies near the fire pit, while Nate tended the gelding and her own smaller mare. The day's tension lingered between them. Dry Lantern had not driven him out, but it had not welcomed them either. Eli knew what the listeners might already be asking. Why did he insist on staying close to a town that clearly saw Nate as a problem? And why did Nate not demand they leave? The truth was practical. Eli needed work, and ranches in these parts only hired through Dry Lantern. Nate needed salt, flour, and a foothold to trade her herbs. Leaving now would undo the risk they had already taken. That evening, Eli checked his leg by firelight. The swelling had eased, the bandage clean. He felt the pull of pain when he bent it, but the strength was returning. Still, he worried. Would a rancher see a man with a limp and turn him away? A hand who couldn't ride long hours was no use. That thought pressed harder than the wound itself. Nate saw him testing the leg and spoke plainly. "You push too soon, you fail. Then no one will hire you." Eli looked at her, tempted to argue, but stopped. She was right. He knew it. Instead, he asked, "And you? You think they'll let you walk into town again after today?" Nate didn't flinch. "They will if they need what I carry. Men like Cutter speak loud, but their children still fall sick. Their mothers still ask for herbs. Need is stronger than insult." Her confidence steadied him, though he saw the faint shadow of weariness in her eyes. She carried more than she admitted. Fear of being cornered, of being treated as less than human again. She hid it with skill, but Eli had learned to see what silence covered. The next day, Eli worked mending Widow Mayhew's corral in exchange for a place to keep the horses. Nate went cabin to cabin with her herbs. She returned with eggs, a jar of lard, and quiet thanks that were worth more than coin. But trouble wasn't far. Cutter, the ranch hand from the store, had not forgotten the shame she put on him. He waited near the barn with two companions, their courage stoked by whiskey. Eli saw them first when he came around the fence with a post on his shoulder. The three men stood in the dust, Cutter loud enough for everyone to hear. "Town don't need a snake biter and her broken drifter. We got enough mouths already." Nate stepped forward before Eli could speak, her pouch of herbs in hand again. She called Cutter's friends by name. She had asked around quietly, learned who they were, and what families they belonged to. "Your sister with the cough. I gave her sage. Your boy with the cut hand. I wrapped it. Do you call that trouble?" Her words cut sharper than a blade. The two men faltered, their posture shrinking. They hadn't expected their names to be spoken in front of everyone. Cutter's face tightened with humiliation. He spat in the dirt, tried to push back. "Don't let her fool you. She's nothing but—" Eli's voice broke in, firm but controlled. "Enough." He dropped the fence post and stepped closer, his stance even, his hands open. He didn't swing, didn't threaten, but his presence filled the space. Cutter tried to hold his ground, but the silence of his own companions betrayed him. They turned away, muttering excuses. Eli stopped a step short of Cutter. You've made your point. Now, I'll make a better one next time. This town is too small for enemies that don't need making. His words were plain, but his eyes left no doubt. Cutter swallowed his pride and stepped back. The confrontation ended not with blows, but with shame and the weight of witnesses. That night, by the cottonwoods, Eli and Nate sat by their fire in silence. The question that would rise in any listener's mind hung heavy. Why did Eli choose restraint when he could have fought? Why did Nate not simply walk away from a place that looked at her with suspicion? The answers were unspoken, but clear. Eli had lived through enough violence to know a fist solved little. Nate had walked away from enough places to know she couldn't keep running forever. As the firelight flickered, Eli finally said, "You held your ground today, better than I could have." Nate looked at him, her face unreadable. We both held. For the first time, Eli allowed himself to believe they could. Not just for a day or two, but long enough to carve out a place where both outcasts might stand without being pushed aside. Dry Lantern wasn't safe, but it was the first step towards something more than survival. The following week in Dry Lantern unfolded slowly, measured not by days on the trail, but by chores and small exchanges that decided whether strangers were tolerated or driven out. Eli and Nate settled near Widow Mayhew's place, where a corral leaned half-collapsed and the grass grew thin along the fence line. In exchange for keeping their horses there, Eli worked with steady hands, cutting new posts and hauling wire, while Nate helped the widow tend to her garden and patched a torn roof shingle with tar and cloth. The town watched them with wary eyes at first, but necessity has a way of softening suspicion. For listeners wondering why Eli clung to Dry Lantern instead of moving on, the answer lay in what each day gave him: a task to complete, a meal earned with his hands, and a place to sit at dusk that wasn't borrowed from the wilderness. He had drifted for years, but here was a chance, fragile and easily broken, to prove he could stand still without losing himself. For Nate, the question was sharper. Why not leave after Cutter's words and the weight of stairs? She stayed because she had traded long enough to know usefulness outweighed prejudice. Each cabin she visited confirmed it. When she eased a child's fever with willow bark or soothed an old man's aching joints with salve, she gained a foothold no insult could erase. One evening, the widow invited them both to her table. The room smelled of boiled potatoes and bread, and for a moment Eli felt something he hadn't in years: warmth without cost. He saw the way Nate kept her posture straight, shoulders tense, as if waiting for the kindness to be taken back. But when the widow passed her a plate with equal measure, no less than Eli's, Nate allowed herself to sit easier. That small act, witnessed by no one but them, settled into Eli's chest heavier than any coin. The bond between Eli and Nate grew not through words, but through the rhythm of shared work. He mended fence lines while she fetched water. He split logs while she traded herbs for eggs or a sack of grain. They spoke little, but when they did, it was plain and honest. Eli told her once, late at night by the fire, about the woman who had turned him away, saying his hands belonged to the trail. She wasn't wrong, he admitted, staring at the calluses, but she wasn't right either. A man's hands can change if he lets them. Nate listened, her gaze steady, and after a pause she said, "A woman's life can change too, if she does not let others own it." Their words were not declarations, but confessions, drawn out by the quiet safety they had built together. The townsfolk began to notice. The widow spoke kindly of them at the store. A rancher whose fence Eli had helped patch offered coffee beans instead of coin, and Nate accepted them with a small nod. Cutter still lurked near the saloon, his pride wounded, but fewer men listened to his talk now that their children had been helped by Nate's herbs or their corrals steadied by Eli's hands. Suspicion hadn't vanished, but usefulness had planted something sturdier than gossip. For any who wondered whether Eli's leg had healed enough for ranch work, the answer came in the way he moved, still stiff, but strong enough to ride and labor. He tested himself each day, carrying more weight, working longer hours. Nate kept watch, caution in her eyes, but she did not stop him. She understood his need to prove he was more than a man who had nearly been left for dead in the desert. One night, as they sat by their campfire near the cottonwoods, Eli looked across the flames at her. "You could leave now," he said, voice low but certain. "You have what you need. Why stay?" Nature's answer was slow, deliberate. "Because leaving every place means you belong nowhere. I'm tired of being a ghost." Eli absorbed her words in silence, the weight of them pressing deeper than any wound. He had told himself the same, though never so plainly. In that moment, their exile from past lives no longer felt like separate roads, but like one path they had chosen to walk together, even if neither admitted it aloud. By the week's end, the corral stood strong. Nature's pouch was replenished with new herbs and food, and the town, though not fully accepting, no longer whispered as loudly when they passed. The questions of whether they could remain, whether Dry Lantern would turn on them, or whether they would choose to move on lingered in the air. But for now, the firelight between them was steady, and the silence they shared had begun to feel less like survival and more like belonging. The days in Dry Lantern settled into a fragile rhythm, but rhythms in the territory rarely lasted. On the fourth morning, the peace broke with the sound of hooves pounding fast from the north. A rider came hard into town, dust boiling off his horse, his hat tilted back, voice ragged from shouting. "Fences down, herds pushing toward the river road. Wagon coming through will be crushed if they don't turn them." His urgency pulled people from doorways, and heads snapped toward the pastures beyond town. Eli stiffened. His thighs still ached, but the bite was healing well enough for him to ride. For listeners wondering whether he could keep up now, the answer was tested in this moment. He didn't think, he just moved. He grabbed his saddle horn, hauled himself up, and despite the flash of pain, found his seat. Nature was right behind him, swinging onto her smaller mare with a coil of rawhide rope already in hand. No one had asked them to help, but the need was clear. They reached the break fast. The fence sagged where cattle had pushed through, the posts split from dry rot. Dozens of animals pressed toward the river road, their weight and confusion enough to crush a freight wagon expected within the hour. Eli and Nate split without wasted words. He rode wide, pushing at the flank with whistles and sharp claps, guiding the herd away from the road. Nate cut across the lead, her horse nimble in the dust, and when a skittish heifer bolted toward a gully, she threw her loop clean. The rope snapped tight against her saddle horn, her body braced, holding steady until Eli could reach her and free the heifer back to the herd. Sweat streaked Eli's face as he rode hard, but he felt the strength in his leg holding true. The wound was no longer a weight, just a reminder. He pushed through, driving the cattle back until the herd turned on itself, circling safely into the open field. Dust choked the air, and the bawling of cattle echoed off the hills, but the danger had passed before the wagon ever came into sight. The rancher, a tired man with sun-cracked lips and worn boots, rode up with gratitude playing on his face. "Would have lost half the herd and a freight wagon besides if not for you two." "I'll pay." He reached for his pocket, but Eli shook his head, breath still heavy. "Keep your coin. Give us posts and wire for Widow Mayhew's corral. That's payment enough." The rancher blinked, then nodded slowly. It was a fair trade, and one that made sense to every man watching. Useful work done for useful return. That was something townsfolk respected. Nate sat tall in her saddle, rope coiled neat again. Dust streaked her hair, her face calm, but inside she felt a ripple of something deeper. For once, the people watching did not look at her with suspicion alone. They looked at what she had done. They had seen her hold a wild animal steady, her skill undeniable. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened as she caught Eli's glance across the trampled field. As they rode back, questions hovered, the kind listeners would naturally ask. Had Eli just proved to himself that his leg was strong again, or was he masking pain to appear capable? Would this moment shift the town's view of Nate, or would Cutter and his kind twist it back to suspicion? And beneath it all, what did it mean that Eli had chosen usefulness for others over money for himself? Back at the cottonwoods, Eli tightened the cinch on his gelding with slow precision. His chest ached from exertion, but pride steadied him. Didn't think I'd ride that hard again this soon, he admitted low. You did not fall. Nate replied simply, her tone more acknowledgement than comfort. Then, after a pause, she added, they saw you today, not as a drifter, as a hand who can hold his place. Eli met her eyes, hearing the weight in her words. And they saw you, not as trouble, as someone who kept their herd standing. Nate looked away toward the town, where voices carried faintly. For now, she said. Her caution lingered, but even she couldn't deny the truth. The balance had shifted. For the first time, they weren't only surviving together. They had shown Dry Lantern that their presence meant gain, not loss. As dusk fell, the town carried on with its business. But the story of the snake-bit cowboy and the outcast woman who held a herd steady would not vanish with the light. For Eli and Nate, it marked the beginning of something neither had expected, a place where their worth was measured not by their pasts, but by what they had done side by side. By the time a week had passed since the cattle rescue, the name of Eli and the Apache woman was spoken in Dry Lantern not with whispers of suspicion, but with quiet acknowledgement. The rancher whose herd they had saved spread word of their skill, and Widow Mayhew spoke of their honesty. Yet respect in the territory was never solid ground. It could be eroded by a single voice loud enough, and Cutter had not forgotten the humiliation he carried. He returned late one evening with two companions, their courage steeped in whiskey and spite. They waited behind Widow Mayhew's barn, shadows stretched long by lantern light. Eli had just finished tightening the corral gate when he heard them call out. Cowboy! Cutter's voice was sharp, designed to carry. You gonna let that snake woman keep walking our streets like she belongs? Eli straightened slowly, dusting his hands against his jeans. His first thought was to ignore it. Walking away would spare Nate the spectacle. But another thought pressed just as hard. If he walked now, Cutter's words would linger like truth, and Nate would pay the price. He turned, his stance firm, though his legs still carried the faint stiffness of the old bite. Nate stood a few paces behind, her eyes narrowing as she saw Cutter step forward with his two men. She knew what listeners might wonder in this moment. Why didn't she simply leave Dry Lantern, avoid this endless cycle of insult and suspicion? The answer was clear to her now. Leaving every place meant she would never belong anywhere. She was tired of being a shadow that disappeared when confronted. This time, she stayed. Eli raised his voice, steady and even. If you've got business with me, make it plain. But don't speak her name like it's a curse. Cutter sneered. She fooled you same as she's fooling them. Medicine tricks don't change what she is. His words were sharp, but they rang thinner than before. Eli didn't reach for his gun. He stepped closer with empty hands, his eyes fixed on Cutter. You want to swing, but if you do, it's not just me you're fighting. It's the truth of what she's done here. Ask your friends. Ask their families. Nate's voice cut in before Cutter could answer. She spoke directly to the two men flanking him, calling each by name, words she had prepared because she knew this confrontation would come. Your sister's cough, better since I gave her sage. Your boy's hand, healed with my salve. Would you rather I had left them to suffer? The men shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. One muttered, she's right, Cutter. The other lowered his gaze. Cutter's smirk cracked, replaced by the redness of shame. But shame, mixed with whiskey, can be dangerous. He lunged forward with a wild swing. Eli moved fast for a man who carried an old wound. He stepped aside, drove a clean body punch into Cutter's middle, enough to fold him but not break him. Cutter dropped to his knees in the dust, coughing, unable to speak. His friends didn't move to help him. The silence that followed was heavy. Nate's gaze lingered on the men until they looked away, reminded of the weight of her words and their own families. Eli bent slightly, speaking to Cutter low enough for only those nearby to hear. You can stand up tomorrow and be a better man, or you can keep dragging yourself lower. This town's too small for enemies without reason. He stepped back, giving Cutter space to rise if he chose, but the man stayed on his knees, shoulders slumped. The confrontation ended not with blood, but with choice. Everyone watching, whether behind windows or across the barnyard, saw it for what it was. Later, by the cottonwoods, the fire crackled low. Eli sat with his arms resting on his knees, the weight of the night still pressing on him. He knew listeners would ask why he didn't put Cutter down hard, once and for all, to end the problem. The answer was simple. Men beaten into the ground often return meaner. What broke them was not fists, but the sight of their own neighbors turning away from their words. Cutter had been defeated in the only way that mattered here. Nate sat across from him, her face calm, but her voice carrying quiet resolve. You did not fight for pride. You fought for place. Now they know we will not be pushed. Eli looked at her through the firelight, realizing the truth in her words. For the first time, he felt not just tolerated in Dry Lantern, but anchored, tied to something steadier than drifting. And though Nate gave nothing more than those plain words, he could see the weight lifted from her shoulders, just slightly, but enough to mark the beginning of something more than survival. The morning after the confrontation with Cutter dawned clear, the kind of cool desert air that made a man feel he could breathe easier. Eli rose early, tested his leg, and found the strength in it steady at last. The venom had left its mark, but he was no longer the man who stumbled half dead in the dust. He saddled the gelding without wincing, a small victory that told him his drifting days could end if he chose. Nature was already awake, gathering herbs along the stream's edge. She moved with quiet confidence now, no longer glancing over her shoulder as often as she once did. The people of Dry Lantern had started to accept her presence, not with open arms perhaps, but with a recognition that she was useful and, more importantly, that she was not leaving. For those who had wondered whether she could truly find a place among settlers who once spat at her, this was the answer. She had not begged, she had not pleaded. She had earned her space with steady hands and knowledge no one else carried. That day, the rancher whose herd she and Eli had saved brought fence posts and wire to Widow Mayhew's yard. Eli worked with him through the afternoon, setting posts deep into the soil, tightening the wire until it sang. Nate boiled willow bark tea for the rancher's wife, who suffered from aching joints. The trade was fair, but more than that, it tied them to the town in a way that coin never could. By evening, Widow Mayhew cooked a meal larger than usual: bread, potatoes, a bit of salted pork. She insisted Eli and Nate sit at her table again, this time not as strangers, but as part of something that resembled family. Nate sat a little easier, her shoulders less guarded. Eli noticed the change and let it settle into him like a truth he had been chasing for years. Belonging was not given by birth or promise, but by the work of staying when it would have been easier to walk away. After the meal, Eli stepped outside with Nate. The corral stood strong now, the horses calm within it. The cottonwoods rustled softly in the evening wind. He turned to her, his voice measured but certain. I've been wrong about myself. I thought my hands were only meant for the trail. But maybe they're meant for more, for a table, a fence, a place that holds. He paused, the words heavy but steady. I don't want to keep moving. Not if there's reason to stay. Nate studied him, her face unreadable for a long moment. Then she said, belonging is not what others give. It is what we choose. If you stay and I stay, then it is ours to keep. The next morning, they rode into town together and stood before the circuit judge who kept his records in a locked drawer. Eli signed his name with a steady hand. Nate made her mark, simple but final. They walked out not as drifter and exile, but as husband and wife in the eyes of Dry Lantern. Some stared, some whispered, but no one challenged it. The widow wept openly and pressed bread into their hands as if it were a celebration. That evening, they sat side by side on the small porch Eli had built from leftover lumber, facing the corral that now stood solid against the horizon. The sun dipped low, painting the land in sharp, honest light. His leg had healed, her place had been won, and there were no debts left unpaid, no questions left unanswered. For the first time, both Eli and Nate felt not like wanderers bound to leave, but like people who had chosen to stay. And in that choice, the life they had thought forever out of reach had begun.